Good morning, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Alzheimer's Orange County Facebook Live Education. Thank you for joining us this morning. My name is Melissa Crave. I'm the Director of Education at Alzheimer's Orange County, and it's my pleasure to be with you this morning. Of course, we miss being with you in person, but we're so thankful for technology to enable us to be together. And I'm joined by Dr. Miriam Galindo, who normally teaches this class for us on Tuesdays and has graciously agreed to be with me here on Facebook Live. I want to thank our sponsor for today's class, Bellagio at Capriana. Capriana is an exclusive Oakmont senior living community in Brea. It's a beautiful, one-of-a-kind continuing care retirement community with full amenities, and we encourage you to visit oakmontofcapriana.com if you're interested in learning more about them. As I mentioned, this morning I'm joined by Dr. Miriam Galindo. She's a licensed psychologist, social worker, and nurse. We call her the triple threat. And she has experience in a variety of inpatient and outpatient mental health settings, in addition to experience as a longtime caregiver for her late father, Henry, who was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. And as I mentioned, she's been teaching this class for us for a long time, since before I came on board with Alzheimer's Orange County, and I've learned so much from her, and she has so many great stories and wisdom to share with us today, and so we're excited to have this conversation with you. We encourage you to type in comments or questions as we go. We'll address them. I see some people have already said good morning to us. Thank you. Go ahead and give us a thumbs up if you can hear us. Type, anything you want in the comment box. Just be aware that anything you type is public. It is not anonymous. It will be tied to your name. So just make sure that you're aware of that. So this morning, Dr. Galindo and I are going to be talking about memory loss. We're going to be talking about cognitive changes and how we can cope with some of the changes that we may see in those we love with Alzheimer's disease or another type of dementia or cognitive changes. So welcome, Dr. G. Thanks for being here.
Thank you. And thank you for everybody that's watching today. I'm glad you're with us.
Yes, so am I. I figured we'd start off talking a little bit about the changes that happen in the brain, the physical changes that obviously will lead to some of the changes in outward expression that we'll talk about in a little bit. So maybe we can start there today.
That sounds like a good idea. And Melissa's going to put up on the screen a image that you can follow along. So as I'm describing this. Now, before we get to a description of what happens in the dementia process, we have to clarify that dementia is an umbrella term under which there are several subcategories. Alzheimer's is just one subcategory, dementia of the Alzheimer's type, but there's several different types of dementia. And there's dementia of the Lewy body type, dementia, mild cognitive impairment, dementia frontal temporal lobe, and the list just goes on and on and on. The reason we talk so much about Alzheimer's is that it's the most commonly diagnosed. 60 to 80% of people with dementia have dementia of the Alzheimer's type. The other thing to keep in mind, too, is that some people have a combination of two things going on in their brain that look like dementia on the outside. So it is possible to have Alzheimer's type of dementia and a vascular dementia, something that's preceded by strokes. So when we talk about the normal or the expected pattern of dementia, we're going to talk about a very oversimplified point of view, and I'm going to try to describe the differences between some of the dementias that you see, at least in a condensed version. So if you look at this image, you see inside of this person's head a picture of the brain. And there's one point that is named, and that's the hippocampus. The hippocampus is where short-term memories are stored. So what we typically see manifested in Alzheimer's type of dementia is short-term memory loss. That's what we see first. It's not always that with other type of dementias, like frontal temporal lobe dementia. You see mood changes and personality changes before you see short-term memory loss. So again, back to the Alzheimer's type of dementia, the first thing we see on the outside is loss of short-term memory. Now, the groundwork is laid sometimes 20 years prior to that first indication that something is wrong. And the groundwork that's laid is, at least as far as we can see it, plaques and tangles that accumulate in the brain and create toxicity. And in the presence of toxicity, brain cells die one by one. So the first thing to go again is that short-term memory loss. That's where we see it first. Then if you look at the image and you go to the front of that person's head, that's the frontal lobe. That's where executive and organizational abilities are stored. And so when that part, when toxicity builds up in that part, brain cells die, and you start to see the person lose track of things like their ability to balance a checkbook, directionality. Things that used to seem so easy are taking way too many steps. We'll come up with examples in just a bit, but let's go through this. Then if we move toward the middle of the brain, then we start seeing mood changes. We see auditory and visual hallucinations, difficulties navigating space. So for example, the person may not be able to turn the corner at a door, and instead they fall into a door, or they're losing their directionality again. The back of the brain, just at the top, you can see kind of a cauliflower shape at the very base, but just above that is the occipital lobe, and that's where we make sense of incoming visual stimuli. And so sometimes what you tend to see is difficulty interpreting the environment around that person. And then that cauliflower shape at the base of the skull is the cerebrum, and that's responsible for balance and coordination. So you might see that the person is tripping or not able to keep their balance, or they're not even able to stand up from a chair. And then that brain stem that goes down the neck portion of the drawing, that is responsible for just basic things like heart rate, breathing, and that's typically what you see affected just prior to death. So in the end stage Alzheimer's, you tend to see that part affected. In the very middle of the brain, we're going to talk about this more as this video progresses, but if you see kind of, imagine this as a donut, and right in the very center, just above where that pointer is describing the hippocampus, that is called the limbic system. And that is where pure raw emotions are stored. And the brain around it, that gray matter, is responsible for interpreting emotions. And when that gray matter, the brain, is no longer functioning the way it used to, the person seems to be erratic to us caregivers. But truly what's happening is they're having trouble interpreting the emotions that are coming up inside. So we're going to talk more about that. The takeaway from this picture that I want you to keep in mind is dementia, and particularly Alzheimer's type of dementia, is not just about losing your memory. So sometimes you'll hear people saying, well, they forgot where they were going, they forgot what they had for breakfast, they forgot who I was, and then they forgot to swallow, and then they forgot to eat, and then they died. That's not the progression. The progression that we need to understand as caregivers is that the person is really experiencing damage to their brain. And so as caregivers, it's important for us to understand that they're doing the best they can with what they've got. They're dealing with a brain that is progressively becoming damaged over time.
Yeah, I
So,
think, I'm sorry. I just wanted to comment really quickly because this slide is taken from a video that we typically share during this class. You know, it's a 3-minute video. It's available on our website. It's called What is Alzheimer's? And I know that you and I had the same reaction, I think, when we both watched it for the first time because you've shared about it. how it kind of was like a gut punch a little bit, and just watching the changes. And so, we talk about these changes and it's difficult, but I think it's important to understand what's going on. It's important for all of us as caregivers to understand what's going on in the brain, because we see our person and they look the same. I mean, generally on the outside, we can't see the changes happening in the brain. And so that's not always our first thought, that, these outward expressions that we'll talk about are the result of a changing interpretation of the environment because of these changes in the brain. So I think it's really important that we start here.
That's correct. That's correct. So what we see is what we'll show you in the next slide. What we as caregivers see is the outward manifestations of brain damage. And those would be in the form of behaviors and in personality changes. So if you go to the right-hand side, we'll start with the very top, becoming agitated. There is a very real phenomenon that happens with persons with dementia, and that is a inward restlessness, this sense that they need to go someplace or they need to do something. And in earlier stages, it may manifest as a person wanting to just to leave. And later, when balance and coordination are affected, it might manifest in just a lot of restlessness with the hands, a lot of picking at things that perhaps are not something you want them to pick, their skin, their hair, scratching, that sort of thing. But if we remember that this is brain-based, then we can get more creative about how to respond. Worry is very, very typical. That typically in our brains, we have the ability to stop a worry, to replace it, or to distract ourselves. But when our brain is damaged in that area, we have this tendency to worry over and over and over, and no ability to stop it. And we really our loved ones rely on us caregivers to stop that or distract that for us. Getting lost is very typical. Being resistant to taking medications, very typical. Sleep issues is very typical, because the brain is responsible for sleep-wake cycles. And if that portion of the brain is damaged, then the ability to know when to wake up or when to fall asleep is compromised. Seeing and hearing things is not unusual. Auditory and visual hallucinations are brain-based. And so at some point in the dementia process, you may see this in your loved one, that they're seeing and hearing things that you and I aren't seeing. Not trusting what other people are saying is expected. If you're having trouble as somebody with dementia remembering what's going on around you, or your senses are deceiving you because your brain is not cooperating, the things are not going to make sense. And what your caregiver is telling you is not going to comport with what your senses are taking in. So a lot of trust issues manifest. Being confused, obviously, and then the repetition, repeating questions or repeating phone calls or repeating behaviors. So these are the outward manifestations of brain damage. It's a progressive neurological decline. That's what we have to remember as caregivers, not just a memory issue.
Thank you. We're going to talk next about how to address the things that we see, how to manage them. I know you and I are both long-term caregivers, you for your father, myself for my mother, who's actually in late stage now. And just thinking about when I would see the things that you just talked about on the previous slide, and kind of in the early days, how I would react. And how, when I started taking classes like this, I learned that that was just making things worse, right? I was escalating the situation. And so we're going to get into talking a little bit about strategy, but I just kind of want to mention that, as we talk about these things and as we talk about the do's and the don'ts later on, it's just, we're all just doing the best that we can. We're all just learning as we go. These things are not easy to manage. It's not easy when a loved one who we've known our whole life all of a sudden has these, pretty big changes in how they react in situations and how they react to us. And if they're not trusting what we're saying, if they're repeating things that don't make sense to us, it's so common for our initial response to be like, what are you talking about? That's not right, and correct them and remind them, and just thinking about how that then would escalate a situation And so we're going to talk about kind of a better way to do it. It's not easy though, as I mentioned, but it's something that we talk about in our classes, and it's called the idea model. And this isn't necessarily, we're not going to be talking about this as a piece of paper you carry around. This is your script, and whenever you encounter a behavior expression, you have to whip out your idea model. This is really a framework for talking about a way to think about a behavior expression that you see, and be able to kind of calm your initial reaction and then think about what might be going on behind the scenes and how can we address that. And really the goal is not, the goal is really preventing as much of this from happening as possible, to stay ahead of things that we see. And so I'll turn it over to you, and you can talk about that a little bit more.
And I'm going to reinforce that before we get into the idea model. One of the things that is so stressful about being a caregiver of a loved one with dementia is the uncertainty. And you're dealing with a lot of uncertainty. You're dealing with maybe a doctor who says, I don't know what you can anticipate in the next several months. You deal with research that says, we don't know what the cause is. We don't know what the cure is. And each day you think that you've mastered something, the next day will bring something new. So it's a very stressful process, and you have to do a lot of self-forgiveness, and recognizing your reaction is a large part of it is just anxiety, dealing with a lot of uncertainty. So what the ideal model tries to do is, again, think 20 steps ahead and approach it like a detective. And just break down the problem so it doesn't seem so overwhelming. The first step of the idea model is to identify what the problem is, and to try to be as objective as possible about it, and as descriptive as possible. For example, instead of putting meaning onto it, he doesn't want to do, fill in the blank. You simply say, he's not taking a shower. What is the problem? He's not taking medication. So you just identify what the problem is. The next step is exploring what might be occurring. Why could this possibly be occurring? Because with every behavior and every personality change, there's a purpose behind it. We just have to be clever detectives and figure out what that purpose is. And that takes a lot of intuition. It takes a lot of empathy, and trying to see things from your loved one's point of view through their brain. And then the last step in this acronym is to adjust your approach. So there's actually 3 things you could potentially adjust. One of the things is just not even a choice. You can't adjust them. They're doing the best thing they can with what they've got. But you can adjust your reaction, and you can adjust the environment. And my suggestion would be adjust the environment first. And if that fails, or if you find that it's really not something to do battle about, it's just not worth it, then you can adjust your attitude and come to a place of acceptance. And we'll talk hopefully about a couple of examples that are just not worth the battle. Because ultimately, really, quality of life becomes more important than getting things done. So task completion, when you're dealing with somebody with who's struggling with dementia, becomes less important than having more joy than not, and eliminating anxiety and fear. Those become the 3 most important things of every day. Having more joy than not, eliminating anxiety, eliminating fear, and pain. You can throw that into eliminating pain. But task completion, making sure you have outfits that match, those become less of something you want to do battle about.
Absolutely. And the thing that I like about this framework of this model, it does require us to think about behaviors differently. Typically, if we're thinking about them in the traditional way of, well, that person's just reacting, they're resisting, they're agitated, they're combative, right? And it's for no reason at all. It's just the dementia, we see that. But really, when we think about exploring problems in this way and being a detective, it requires us to think about that behaviors actually probably do have some purpose behind them. There's an unmet need. There's something that's triggering it. And we just have to think about, what that could be, and go through and be a detective. So I like this model for that reason. Shall we talk about some examples?
Let's talk about some examples.
Okay. And I put these up here because these are common ones that we hear about all the time. I would encourage anyone with us right now to type in examples of things that maybe you've struggled with loved ones or friends, or comments as we talk. But we'll kind of go through some of these and maybe some other examples as well, and just kind of discuss what might be our initial reaction or what we might want to say, and then what might be a better way to kind of, again, be a detective, think about what could be going on, and how then we can, of course, adjust the environment or ourselves. So I would like to start off with personal care, because I know that's a question we get all the time, especially bathing, which you've mentioned before. And I love the story that you tell about your father and helping him with that task. And maybe you can talk about that a little bit.
Yeah. Showering and bathing is, it's not an unusual a challenge that comes up at some point in the dementia process. And I'll talk about my dad only because talking about patients would violate their privacy. And my dad taught me so much about really entering his world in the most empathic way, and to understand where he was coming from. So I'll share what worked for him. But again, the first step is to try to determine, is this worth the battle? Is somebody not taking a shower or not shaving or not tending to their dental care, is that worth the battle? And to me, it was, because if it's 1 week, that's one thing. But if it's 1 month or 2 months, it's quite another. Then that becomes a health and safety issue. And so that was goal number one. But I also wanted to maintain that quality of life, to bring more joy than not, to eliminate the anxiety and eliminate the fear. And so what I didn't want to do is have him take a shower where he's screaming the whole time and having a terrible time. Number one, I almost will guarantee that he will never do it again because it was so miserable. And number two, it's just painful for him. I want him to have a good quality of life. So the things to keep in mind when it comes to hygiene are establishing a routine, because routine seems to transcend that brain damage. When you do something the same way, the same time, at either every other day or every single day, or at least on a frequent basis, it tends to be retained by that brain, despite the brain damage. The second thing is to establish a pattern. And that, what I mean by that is you associate or you pair the desired behavior with something positive. When you pair the desired behavior with something positive, the behavior will be repeated, but it will be repeated under pleasant circumstances. So, for example, pairing a desired behavior with something positive could be, I want the person to do A, so I'm going to make sure that we always do it with food associated with it, or a candy associated with it, or ice cream. Or, like in my dad's case, and I'll describe it to you, I paired it with music. The research will tell us that for whatever reason, the music centers of the brain are spared for a long period of time the ravages of dementia. So why not use that? So you associate the positive with the desired behavior. So in my case, what I did, or my dad's case, what I did is I associated each step of the showering process with music. There was processional music to go into the bathroom. There was triumphant music in the shower. And for my dad, I thought Camelot might do the trick. And actually, Camelot did do the trick. And then when we got him out of the shower, then shaving time was accompanied by Irish bar tunes. And then after shaving time, there was a dance party, replete with Fred Astaire. And that was repeated every single time, so that the shower time became just an association with that music. Music was also used with things like sleep, wake, energizing, quieting. So music was really instrumental in making sure that the brain kind of was oriented to what it was supposed to do. The most important thing with hygiene too is to recognize that the person's experience of this process is very different than you and I. The senses are controlled by the brain. So your ability to interpret visual incoming stimuli, tactile, what you can feel, auditory stimuli, that's all controlled by the brain. So if there's brain damage in that area, it's going to misinterpret all of that information. So for example, water coming out of a shower head from above is going to look very frightening and threatening. And so it may be necessary for us as detectives to say, if I were in their shoes, I would find that to be frightening. I'm going to get a handheld shower head instead of one that just comes out of the wall. Likewise, the temperature is going to be interpreted differently. So the temperature of the water may feel more hot, or it may feel more cold, or the pelting of the water may actually hurt and may again feel threatening. And so we have to keep all those things in mind and figure out a way where shower time or bath time is more pleasant than frightening. One final thing, and I'm going to ask Melissa if she's had any experiences or for her input on this, but to look visually at the environment itself. Is there anything that would be a barrier to having a pleasant experience? So, for example, in my case, or my father's case, there were shower mats that would be perceived by somebody with dementia as threatening. So keep in mind that with dementia, one's ability to assess depth perception is compromised, or patterns on the rug or patterns on the floor. So a dark bath mat or a dark towel might be perceived as a hole in the floor. Mm-hmm. And so the person may want to avoid that area or they're overstepping the area because they see it as a hole rather than a towel. So it's very important that there's light colors, that it's very clear where to step and where not to step. It should be a very inviting experience. And more joy than not. So Melissa, you have some thoughts about this too, because I know this is a very, very common experience.
Absolutely. And I'm just thinking, as you're listing all of these things, there's so many things that we can do, which can be overwhelming on the one hand, but it also means we have so many options of things that we can try and change, which I feel like is a good problem to have, that we have so many things available to us to try to change. And maybe we can't change them all at once, but maybe next time we try, we try that handheld shower, which I think is so important. And I'm really glad that you mentioned that, because one of the stories that I wanted to share is a story I read about a physician who actually, she developed a program called Bathing Without a Battle. And you can search it. It's actually free to view. It's kind of an older program, and it's meant for nurses, but I think it's super valuable for anyone looking for a really in-depth look at tips on bathing. But the woman that developed this program, she thought that it was really important that she knew what it felt like to be bathed by her staff at this nursing facility. And so she really went above and beyond. She had them completely disrobe her and bathe her as they would another resident there. And even though she was in complete control, she knew what was going on. She knew and loved her staff, and they were very kind. She said it felt humiliating and embarrassing, and that things that typically felt pleasurable about a shower to her, like water running over her face, when that was out of her control, it felt torturous. And so imagine, for her, someone who knows she's in control, who knows she can just get up and walk out, and that this is temporary and this isn't forever. And then thinking about somebody who might not be aware of all those things, who doesn't feel in control, who doesn't know that it's temporary, who doesn't know necessarily that the person bathing them has their best interest in mind and is doing this out of love. And so there are all those elements to think about, and not just the environment, but also in our approach, and really trying as much as we can to put ourselves in that person's shoes and think about how might this water feel, and how might this, do they feel steady? Do they feel stable? And the other thing I wanted to mention is something from Teepa Snow, who I also admire a great deal, and she's an occupational therapist and has a lot of training videos, and she mentions, like you mentioned, the importance not only of the temperature of the water, but also of the room, Because think about, a common thing as well, they don't want to take their clothes off. And just thinking about, well, would you want to take off your clothes if you were in a cold bathroom, right? Probably not. So to make it a little bit easier and more inviting to do that, make the temperature in the bathroom very warm. If you are clothed, you should be sweating. That's what she says, because if once you take off your clothes, you want it to be a comfortable temperature for that person. So really just taking steps to make it as easy as possible so that you're not having to battle. And I know that you mentioned, this is worth battling over, but then the way you describe it, it's not really a battle. You turn it into something that's not a battle.
Right.
And I think that's so important to emphasize. And just like Ben commented there, if you don't insist, they can't resist. And we say that phrase all the time, and that's so true. And somebody else commented, can you repeat the phrase that you mentioned, more joy than not? I think you said it again too, and that seems to be something that you say a lot. Maybe you could talk a little bit more about that.
That quality of life rises as a topmost priority, and the quality of life that I would define as more joy than not, and an elimination of anxiety, pain, and fear. So, and I want to emphasize what Melissa just said. One of the things that your empathy toward your loved one will discover is that at the core of a lot of the behavior, even if it comes across as angry and agitated and aggressive, at the base of that is a lot of fear. There are things that are happening that are completely out of their control, and it's frightening to them. And the other thing I want to add to, Melissa, that you just reminded me of, is when we empathize and we recognize things like you were talking about, would you want to take your clothes off in a cold bathroom? Well, that helps us get creative. We can be creative detectives as we try to figure out what's going on. You don't have to take a shower with everything completely off. The ability to get a modesty towel, something that can be wrapped around them with Velcro. They can wear it into the shower if they really want to. The goal is not to do it perfectly. The goal is to do it in a way that works for them, that gets them reasonably clean, so that they can, again, have that more joy than not.
So I'm so glad you mentioned that. There's so many things to think about when bathing, but even in that same video that I was mentioning, Teepa Snow puts a warm towel around the person and then even wets them through that towel. There's so many options like that available. So good. Well, we can move on. If anybody has more questions about bathing, please feel free to put them in the comments. But medication's another big one that I know I've encountered at points. I'm sure you have too. And either the distrust of what is this pill, I don't want to take it, or just kind of not understanding why, or feeling like we're telling the person what they need to do. So maybe we can talk through some strategies for that as well.
Yeah, and the typical reaction when somebody doesn't want to do something that you're feeling strongly they need to do is to get frustrated, to try to reason with them, to try to say, you need to take these pills, your doctor says you need to take these pills. And anybody who's tried that will find that not only is it not working, but it's making things worse. Because if you engage in a power struggle, even with somebody whose brain is not compromised, you're going to get resistance and defensiveness. It's the nature of human beings. And so what you're trying to do as an empathic caregiver is to understand where they're coming from and to try to speak their language, so that whatever is causing the resistance or the anxiety can be alleviated and reduced. Again, that routine is very important, to do the same thing every time, as frequently as possible. That can get retained by a brain even as it's damaged by the effects of dementia. The second thing is to employ that associative learning. And like I said before, associative learning means pair the desired behavior with something positive. Don't pair it with something negative, because you're going to guarantee that the person is going to be equally resistant the next time around. But pair it with something positive. So what I mean by that is, you may want to always associate medication time with lunch. It always happens at lunchtime. So there you've got the routine, but you also have something positive. There's some good food at the end of the finish line. Or pair it with a walk, or pair it with a good TV show. We're going to take our pills and then we're going to watch Jeopardy. The third thing you can possibly do when you're exploring the possible reasons for medication resistance is, Melissa just pointed out that sometimes people don't feel they need to take medication. I don't have anything wrong with me. And so it's a clever thing that a caregiver can do to enlist the help of an authority figure or somebody that your loved one wants to please or that your loved one respects. It could be a doctor. Dr. So-and-so said that this is very helpful to you. He wants you to take these. Or it could be a brother or a sibling or a daughter, somebody, again, that would be persuasive enough to assure your loved one that they're doing the right thing. Keep in mind that as the brain goes, your loved one is more inclined to be persuaded by a number of different learning modalities. So instead of simply telling them something like, you need to do this and you need to do that, a clever caregiver will try to use visual props or some kinetic learning. So what I mean by that is, in addition to simply telling your loved one that your doctor would really be happy if you took the medication, you may want to pull out a letter written by the doctor to show them that Dr. So-and-so says that this medication would be a good idea. Or a picture, a picture of a sibling or a picture of a daughter. So-and-so says this would be a good idea. So-and-so would be very happy if you took the pills. They take the pills too. Don't worry at this point about whether or not you're speaking the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. The fact is, what you're doing is helping that brain that surrounds the limbic system. Remember that description that I was given before. That feeling part of the brain needs your help in interpreting what's going on. And sometimes you're going to have to simply describe something rather than worrying about, is it factually correct? Mm-hmm. You want to eliminate any kind of power struggles. So arguing, reasoning, trying to persuade with logic is just not necessary. It's only going to escalate emotions, create agitation, the very things you're trying to avoid. And then in your detective process, you might also want to make sure that the medication is not causing distress in your loved ones. So they might be having trouble swallowing the medication. That's a very real phenomenon that happens because swallowing is actually controlled by the brain. So it's important to recognize that. Are they holding the pills in their mouth longer than is typical? Are they not swallowing them at all? Are they pulling them out of their mouths, several minutes later? And if that's the case, you definitely want to talk to your doctor before you try to crush the pills or figure out a different way of giving the pills to your loved one. Some pills are not crushable, and you could do some real damage to crush them and give them to your loved one. But if they are crushable, just make sure that you're following the doctor's recommendations about how to administer those pills to your loved one. The last thing is to make sure you prioritize medications. Remember how I said that all things are not worth the battle, and you have to figure out, is this worth it or not? Some medications are worth it. Medications that could prevent more problems or prevent your loved one from going into the emergency department due to complications like anti-diabetic medication or antihypertensives. Those are a priority. You want your loved one to take those medications. But if your loved one is not wanting to take the fish oil or not wanting to take the multivitamin for the day, you can let that one go, right? So when you give medications, you want to give the priority medications first, the ones that are potentially life-saving. And the ones that, if they take them, they take them. If they don't, they don't. You can put those lowest on the list of priorities, so that if your loved one takes the first two but doesn't take the second two, that you can let it go, and you can just concentrate on what was accomplished rather than what was not accomplished.
Absolutely. And I just want to mention, Ben commented that he had a challenge with crushing meds, actually, because a lot of them tasted pretty terrible, even when mixed with ice cream or pudding. And I mean, aside from consulting with the pharmacist to see if there's another way, if it could be a liquid, or if there's something else you can do, or talking to a doctor. I know that for us, we would often crush pills and pudding, and at first we started putting them in a big bowl of pudding, and then we would have to make sure that she ate the entire bowl. Yes. And it probably tasted pretty off. And then we started just doing it in a spoonful if we could. So at least it was just one spoonful. We knew that she had all of the medication. But it is still tricky, and you kind of have to evolve with the situation and be flexible. Last one I have on the list, although we're open to talking about other things if anybody has any out there, because this is so common, a person either wanting to leave their home, saying, I want to go home, even if they are at home. Commonly they might be, in a continuing or a care community, but they could also be at home. And so I just wanted to mention that that feeling, and that it doesn't always mean that they're thinking of a physical place that they want to go home to, that this home on 15 Elm Street, take me there. It often means that the place that they're in doesn't feel like home for maybe a multitude of reasons. Maybe it's an emotional need for love or security or autonomy. Maybe they feel like throughout the day, all of their choices have been kind of taken away from them, and they don't have anything left to decide for themselves. And so they want to go somewhere else where they feel like they are, in control, and that's their place. Maybe it's an issue of stimulation. Maybe they feel either bored, or maybe it's the opposite. Maybe they're overwhelmed. Maybe it's an environmental type of thing where there's a lot of distractions, a lot of noises, and they just can't find any peace and quiet. And so there could be all these reasons. And really, again, it comes back to being a detective and kind of figuring out, okay, what was happening right before they asked to go home? Or is this happening at the same time every day? Is it after we do a certain activity? And conversely, what's happening when they aren't asking to go home? What is going right when this expression is not happening? Are they contentedly engaged in an activity? Are they well rested and well fed and hydrated? There's just so many things that we can think about. But the first reaction oftentimes when someone says, I want to go home, you are home, right? And that's not always helpful. Maybe it is. Maybe a gentle reminder is what that person needs. See, you're home. This is your room. This is your bed. But oftentimes it's listening to the feeling behind what they're actually saying, and kind of digging down and saying, okay, what can I do to make this place feel more like home? What is it? Tell me what you miss about your home. And maybe that's an invitation for them to talk about something that you hadn't even thought of. So anything that you'd like to add there? Or
I'll just reinforce something that you mentioned, and that is that restlessness that we talked about before is a very real thing. And so sometimes an effort to leave is a response to an internal drive to just get this restlessness need met. And so if your loved one is inclined to wander, it's really important that you do meet that need for energy discharge. And that might be going for a walk. That might be fencing off a patio and allowing for, just unfettered activity outside, just walking around. But definitely to meet that need for some kind of stimulation, to meet that internal restlessness. So for my dad, I know that it was met with very simple activities like sweeping a patio. There was precision sweeping going on, but he swept and swept and swept and swept, and it really met that need for something to do with his hands and his body. Other times it could be, for him, it was folding laundry repeatedly over and over and over. And he made the perfect piles of white towels, and then we would go in there and thank him and pick up the laundry basket, and then come in with the same laundry basket, but unfolded laundry and start all over again. And it really gave him a sense of meaning and purpose. Again, we're trying to look at this through their brain, through their eyes. So it's not what gives us meaning and purpose. It's what gives them meaning and purpose. A third thing that seemed to provide meaningful activity for him was looking through photos, looking through mail. It could be the same mail, but he felt, he seemed satisfied with that purposeful activity. And so it was just a pile of mail with Christmas cards and birthday cards and anything that looked interesting to him. And he would go through it over and over and over. But again, to recognize that very real sense of needing to be someplace and not feeling quite satisfied with where they are now. One thing that we should probably, something you all know already, but I'm just going to reinforce, is the risk of getting lost is very high among those who are at a moderately severe stage of dementia, because they will listen to that internal drive to leave, and then they'll not know where they are. And so it's very important that you make arrangements with your local police department, that they already have all the information they need on file, that you figure out a way to affix a GPS monitoring system on your loved one, and that you pay attention to things like where you put locks on the doors so that they're easy for you to find, but not necessarily easy for your loved one to find. And just figure out a way to keep things as safe as possible. And that might also be the need to recruit other people on your team, that you may be finding that it's just exceeding what one person like you can provide. And so you want other people on your team, and that team is going to expand more and more to help you with this process. Can you think of anything else, Melissa, when it comes to, this home is not mine, or wanting to leave, or restlessness?
Yeah, I mean, there's, like we've talked about, just it really comes down to knowing details about that person, and what works for somebody might not work for everybody else. There's not necessarily a manual, but there are things we can definitely try. And I think what we've talked about has been really good. I do want to address a couple questions that came in that are kind of related.
Okay.
And one of them is, how do you deal with someone seeing multiple people? Not exactly sure, but then it goes on to say, or not recognizing you and wanting you to leave. So maybe a family member not recognizing you. Maybe you can speak to that a little bit.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm glad you asked this question, because sometimes people will say, oh, they forgot who this person is. And it's just crushing, when you're a daughter or a son or a husband or a wife, your first reaction is, how could they forget me? But what needs to be remembered is there's a portion of the brain responsible for facial recognition. And some people are actually born without that ability to recognize faces, and some people are born with an extremely intact ability to recognize faces, and they can remember faces from 20, 30 years ago. But that feeling you get when you recognize somebody out of context, like in a grocery store, and you're thinking, who is that person? I know that person. And then you get in your car and realize, oh my gosh, that's so-and-so from high school. That's what's going on in a person with dementia. They kind of know who this person is on some level, but it's not coming to them. So two things to keep in mind. One is that instead of saying, remember, I'm so-and-so, remember, I'm your daughter, remember, I'm your son, the important thing to do is simply orient them. So you get right in their line of vision and you introduce yourself. I'm Miriam. I'm here to help you. Or I'm your daughter and I'm here to help you. If daughter is going to send them over the edge, no, you're not my daughter, then you just say, I'm Miriam. I'm here to help you. The second thing you mentioned is that not recognizing the person and then wanting them to leave. Mm-hmm. You'll find sometimes that comes with the time of day, or it might come in seasons. Like, for example, Um, Before the sun comes up or after the sun comes down, you might see that level of agitation increase. Get out of my room. I don't want you here. And no amount of trying to reassure them or I'm here to help you or I'm your daughter, none of that works.
Mm-hmm.
But then as soon as the sun goes up, you might see a completely different response. So as you're being a detective, try to figure out, when does it work? When does it not work? Is this person completely disoriented to their environment and I just happen to be part of it or not? The third thing is the people, you want to look at frequency too. Remember how I said patterns and routines are what helps. It transcends that, the ravages of the brain. So the more frequently the person is exposed to a certain person, the more likely they are to be able to retain information. So facial recognition may not be perfect, but they can certainly respond positively to a person they see every day, as opposed to a person they see monthly or every 6 months. So that would be something you would want to explore too. So the word for it, in case you want to write down fancy words, is prosopagnosia. It means you've lost your ability to recognize faces. And the part of the brain responsible for that, in case you want to look it up, is the fusiform gyrus. It's that part of your brain is responsible for facial recognition. So the next time you're in a grocery store and you say, I think I know that person, but I can't remember where, you can blame it on your fusiform gyrus.
Thanks for that tip.
I hope that answers your question, because that's a challenging one. It's a very emotional one.
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks for asking. I think we'll end on this last question and then maybe wrap up. And this is, kind of another question about something we often face, which is guilt as caregivers.
Yeah.
He says, I would appreciate some feedback on how to deal with a loved one who wants to live with her kids and the constant guilt for not being able to have that as an option, and the actual feeling of abandonment that is felt by that person. So there's a lot of emotion in there in that situation, but maybe we can speak to it a little bit.
Yeah. And I'll give my input, and Melissa, you can offer as well. I think one of the hardest parts about watching your loved one go through dementia is this empathic suffering that you yourself are feeling, that you are struggling so much to meet the need, and all of us struggle with a sense that our efforts to meet the need are falling short. And the thing to keep in mind is the person's health and safety are a priority. And so you're going to find that you wish you could give them the moon, but the moon is not necessarily the healthiest thing, and it's not the safest thing. This is most painful when people start to consider things like out-of-home care, and they wrestle with their own hearts about, is that the best thing for my loved one? And you really have to lean on what's the healthiest and what's the safest. So your suffering, I think, is the most important, and we're going to talk more about what you can do to address that and to transcend that, so that your suffering is not compromising your ability to help your loved one. Do you want to add something to that?
I would just echo that sentiment of the guilt. No matter what we do, it doesn't feel like enough, no matter the situation. It always feels like we want to do more. And I mean, we're all just doing the best that we can, and we don't all have the perfect options available. And I think just recognizing that, allow yourself to feel a little bit, but then kind of move on and make sure you tell yourself, I'm doing the best that I can for this person. I love them with my whole heart, and they're going to have good days and they're going to have bad days. But we just try to make, more good days than bad days, hopefully. And, that's all any of us can do. So I do want to, as you mentioned, we'll just put this up here briefly. This is a slide we show in almost all of our classes. And it's a really helpful guide, I think. I remember seeing this for the first time, taking a class years and years ago when my mom was in the beginning stages, and thinking, wow, I'm doing everything completely wrong. This is, just a list of, I'm reminding her, I'm trying to reason. And no wonder these situations are escalating when I encounter a challenging situation. So we can speak to this a little bit and then kind of wrap up. But yeah, do you want to go through it a little bit?
Yeah, we talked a little bit about this with hygiene. The don'ts are really clear. Don't rely on parts of the brain that aren't intact. And the part of the brain that is affected by dementia is a part that is responsible for reasoning and logic. So you don't want to use reason. You don't want to argue. You definitely don't want to remind, as in, don't you remember? We already talked about this, because they don't. And so it just causes pain and frustration to go down that line, not just for them, but for you too. And definitely don't take it personally, which is very hard to do. When you're taking care of somebody professionally, it's a little bit easier to be objective because you can go off shift. When you're taking care of your loved one, it is very challenging not to take it personally. And it's very challenging to have a perfect day where you don't react and don't kick yourself for the way you reacted. So you want to be very, you want to remind yourself not to take things personally, and then be extra forgiving to yourself and recognize that you're getting tired, and and um, and all of us have had that experience. So don't beat yourself up too much about it. And then for the do's, it's important to repeat, not to repeat it a different way, not to repeat yourself in a long-winded soliloquy, but to just repeat 2 or 3 words, because the brain that's your loved one is dealing with is trying to retain what you're saying. And if you go on long-winded soliloquies, they're remembering the last word and maybe a word in between, but they have no idea what you just finished saying. And as you add more and more sentences, it's making things more complicated. So with my dad, trying to get him to take a shower, it was just walk this way. Now we're here, right foot up. I mean, it was really in the moment.
Mm-hmm.
Accepting blame. What that means is, no, you're not beating up on yourself, but you are taking the defensiveness down. You're lowering that wall that could potentially cause conflict by simply saying then something that could completely alleviate fear or anxiety or frustration on the part of your loved one. So, for example, my dad had a habit of layering clothes. First thing, by the way, we took mostly everything out of the closet, so there wasn't that temptation to layer clothes. So there would be 2 outfits and that's it. A shirt, pair of pants, that's it. But the second thing is, if he layered clothes, the last thing I wanted to do was fight with him about it and say, you got to take that off. It's too hot. Blah, 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 blah. Mm. What I did instead was to say, wow, I'm really cold. Could I borrow one of your shirts? And he, of course, that would appeal to his chivalry. So he would take off his shirt and give it to me. And then I'd complain about the cold again, and he'd give me another. So I'd be wrapping myself up in his shirts. Brilliant. And accomplish the same goal. But the acceptance of blame, and this is along the same lines, if he did become frustrated, I would say, you seem upset. I'm sorry. Will you forgive me? And of course he would forgive me. Mm-hmm. Does that mean it's all my fault and I should feel terrible about myself? Not necessarily. It simply means I understand and it's okay. And by accepting blame, you diffuse the situation. The third thing to do to diffuse a situation is just leave the room. Reboot the whole situation. Come back when the gears have shifted. The person may be in an agitated state, but as you leave the room, wait a couple of minutes, come back in, you might find that the person is in a completely different frame of mind and will be more accepting of whatever you're trying to get them to do. And then, of course, agreeing. Find things to agree about. That's true. You're right. People are more inclined to allow their emotions to dissipate if they feel that they've been heard and understood. And then using distraction simply means redirecting. So if a person's focused on, I want to live with my kids, I really want to live with my kids, I don't like where I'm living, the best thing to do sometimes is to not get into an argument about that point, but to refocus onto something positive. Wow, look at that garden. Let's go walk. Let's go for a walk out in the garden. Look at all the beautiful flowers. So there's a redirection to get them off of what they're focused on, which is only creating negativity. And by redirecting onto a positive environment or subject area, you're introducing what I was telling you before, that more joy than not. And so that's what we mean by distraction.
That's great. All right. Well, I would love to end our time by something that you usually start our time with during this class that I think is so important and often so overlooked, and more important now than ever, because we are all, I think I probably speak for all of us when I say we're all kind of anxious all the time, like this low level anxiety about what's going on in the world. And that can often definitely, be mirrored onto our person for sure. So I'd love it if you would kind of end us and take us through what you do here, taking a breath.
Yes. So two things. One thing is what we talked about initially. One of the things that creates a stress response in us human beings is uncertainty. Our brains crave certainty. We like control. We like to know what's happening next. And when we're in uncertain circumstances, it creates a sense of dread, a sense of anxiety and stress, and that's very human. The challenge is to make sure, especially through your dementia caregiving process, that your body does not suffer as a result of that stress response, because it truly is a stress response, and it can do some real damage to your cardiovascular system and your organs and your cells at a cellular level, and even your own brain. And so what we like to talk about in our live classes is the importance of taking care of you, which sounds so foreign, I know, because your focus is on your loved one, but it's very important that you make it, because your loved one is depending on you. And so the way you make it is you override that stress response by tricking your own brain into thinking everything's okay. And the best way to do that is your intake of oxygen. So taking a deep breath is actually a very real way of overriding that stress response. And my suggestion would be that you take in a deep breath, 3 breaths at a time, 3 deep breaths at a time, 3 times a day. And you can do it as you're walking. Slow down your walking to a very, a pace that should match your heart rate, a normal heart rate, and take some very deep cleansing breaths. And the way you're going to do it is you exhale completely, inhale on the count of 4, hold it on the count of 4, and then exhale through your mouth on the count of 4. Do that 3 times a day, or 3 breaths like that 3 times a day. And I promise you, your stress response will be minimized. The other thing too, just a little plug, surround yourself with music. Because remember how I was saying the music has this ability to transcend the damage of the brain that is dealing with dementia, but it can also help you. There's an extraordinary amount of research that reinforces that the stress response is lowered by music, especially classical music or music that matches the normal heart rate. And so you can surround yourself with beautiful music, deep breathing, and those are ways to just take care of yourself as you get through this. We want you to make it to the finish line. We're here to help you. This is a team process. You should not have to go through this alone. And we at Alzheimer's Orange County, we volunteers are so wanting to be partners in your journey.
Thank you so much. That was perfect. And yes, I find that music, even for myself, is we've been turning off the TV a little bit more these days after just consuming so much news and information, and turning music on at night instead. And it's been a lot more peaceful, I can tell you that. I put our helpline number in the comments there. And again, thank you so much for chatting today. If you are interested, Dr. Galindo will be doing a webinar for us in a few weeks on May 13th. And you can find that information on our website. I'll post a link in the comments here as well for you to register. You just sign up, it's free, and then it'll be at 11:30 a.m. on May 13th. That's a Wednesday. She'll be talking about becoming a resilient caregiver, such an important topic, and we'll be talking more about this stuff that we talked about today as well. We'll be here again next Tuesday. I'll be with Kim Bailey. We'll be talking about some ways to make our time at home meaningful together, how to engage our loved one and in contented involvement and make sure that they are stimulated. And so again, thank you all for being with us. We really appreciate you spending some time with us this morning, and stay safe and be well. And we will see you again next time. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Have a good day.
You too.